Okay, welcome to In Defense of the Revolution, a Cuba Solidarity podcast from the Canadian perspective. My name is Robert Crooks. I'm here with Cam Scott. So Cuba, for the past week or so, has been dealing with more blackouts. Unfortunately, as of Friday local time, 8:15, a power outage at the Diezmero substation on the outskirts of Havana had caused a significant loss of generation in western Cuba, and with it, the failure of the national electric system. So this is something that's been an ongoing issue for Cuba, especially over the past few months, and it was a big news story in the capitalist world, especially last October. But, consistent misinformation about the causes of these blackouts is being reported in all sorts of media that's unsympathetic towards the Cuban Revolution. So we thought we should talk about this and sort of dispel some of that misinformation.
Yeah, if you were to read about this in the bourgeois media, you would get the impression of mismanagement rather than the accumulated effect of 65 years of blockading and an electrical grid that in many respects hasn't been infrastructurally updated because of the material implications of that blockade for decades, or at least not as comprehensively as would be ideal. This is also the result of gasoline shortages. And here we see multiple regimes of sanctioning exerting an accumulated effect on Cuba, because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the major supplier of oil to Cuba was Venezuela. Last I checked, 25,000 barrels per day. This is a fraction of what it would once have been. And this is because of U.S. sanctions on Venezuela to a large degree that have implicated these relationships. So, Russia and Mexico and some other vendors have picked up the slack somewhat, but we're dealing with really acute gasoline shortages that are the direct result of the instrumentation of the blockade. And simultaneously, you read all of these stories making it seem as if it were a problem with management rather than a problem of imposed scarcity.
Yeah, that's right. And I don't want to pretend that I'm some sort of electrical engineer, but from what I understand is that the power grid has to keep going, and so it has to be kept being fed fuel. And if it doesn't keep getting that fuel, then that's when the complete shutdowns take place. And as you said, Venezuela has been blockaded as well or sanctioned at least by the U.S. government. And I think even today or yesterday, Trump announced a 25% tariff on any country that buys Venezuelan oil. So those sanctions are going to be even deeper now, I suspect.
And really what has been an important relationship for Cuba against the backdrop of these gasoline shortages, and in light of its larger commitments to sustainable energy, is solar power, which depends upon Chinese technology to a large degree, but also local innovation. This will only be deepened in the years to come, but perhaps you saw this horrible opining in the Globe and Mail last October, where Associated Press journalists were asking this ponderous question, if Cuba's power grid is in such poor shape, if Cuba has signed on to the Paris Agreement, right, committing to meet whatever target for renewable energy by 2030, how come Cuba hasn't wholly converted to solar power? And this would be a question that you could ask of any number of capitalist countries, and no one would. But the premise of this article was basically that it was a result of the Cuban government's intransigence before foreign investment and the private sector. that the Cuban government had not liberalized quickly enough to permit foreign investment in solar power on the island. And this narrative is kind of eco-washing regime change rhetoric. I think that that's something to be absolutely maximally incredulous of, because Cuba is a remarkably sustainable society by any reasonable metric, and its climate change goals are being met in many respects under tremendous duress. It's very hard to imagine, when you're being prevented from modernization by the blockade, how you could outpace capitalist countries, except that the motive force of catastrophic climate change is capitalism itself. So I think that this narrative, this greenwashing narrative, is to be completely rejected.
Yeah, and it's funny, that angle of criticism that they're not allowing foreign investment, or they didn't allow foreign investment quick enough. Cuba's actually planning to open 92 solar parks, 55 of which by the end of this year, the others by 2028. And these are partnerships done with capital from China, from Russia, and from Turkey. So it's baffling how much misinformation is allowed to be published in these types of newspapers that people read daily in places like Canada and take at their word.
Yeah, and it's interesting because even if you look at the renewable energy sector profile of Cuba on the Government of Canada website, it talks about the remarkable development of solar and wind and hydropower. Now, this is something that we should be mindful of too. Canada, for its ostensibly more peaceable relationship with Cuba, also is framing Cuba's energy crisis as an opportunity for private investment. But even so, if you look at what's going on in Granma province, if you look at reports from the construction and energy commissions, you see really, really remarkable projects, Chinese donations notwithstanding, that rely upon Cuban capacity for implementation. And it's a really remarkable transformation, I think. Again, this is what we need to constantly underscore, carried out under tremendous duress.
Yeah. So something else in the news this week is that Donald Trump's administration will be revoking the temporary legal status of 530,000 Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans who are currently living in the United States. This is a reversal of the Biden administration's policy, something they called humanitarian parole, which gave people coming to the United States from those countries a 2-year, period where they could try to find other ways of gaining documentation. I'm not exactly sure what the purpose of the 2 years were, but I do think the term humanitarian parole is pretty dystopian. It's sort of a term that only the United States could come up with. It's interesting that this change in tactics by the Trump administration, and not sure where this is going to lead.
Yeah, we were talking about this on the last episode, the specific parole programs that are available to Cubans that have expedited settlement in the U.S. by anti-government dissidents and so on, as well as people pressed by the blockade who wish to send money home. There are other reasons why families wind up being separated by the enmity of the U.S. for Cuba. But it is a fairly drastic reversal, and I think that it speaks to an overarching turn in the Trump government from soft power and the customary means by which the U.S. has destabilized and meddled to a kind of pseudo-protectionist orientation toward the world, strength through power and so on, cut a more menacing figure. It's true that this program was never purely beneficent. Biden initiates this in 2022. I think it rolls out January 2023, and the first people to come into the U.S. under this process are Venezuelan. And this is obviously against the backdrop of concerted attempts to delegitimize PSUV and Maduro in Venezuela. It's condensed as CHNV, this process that applies to Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela, covering a reported, I believe, 213,000 Haitians, 120,000 and some Venezuelans, 110,900 Cubans, and 93,000 Nicaraguans. And again, this process is very capricious. As you said, people have 2 years. These humanitarian parole programs under the Immigration and Nationality Act, they grant authority to the Department of Homeland Security to temporarily waive visa restrictions for certain foreign nationals, I suppose, for significant public benefit. That's a very ambiguous language. Or urgent humanitarian reasons. So it's very changeable, and there are no long-term protections in place. And I think a lot of people prior to this have been cycled in and out of an informal labor market in the United States by deceiving legislation such as this. But the Trump reversal, it's kind of a short circuit in the customary means by which the U.S. has approached the question of Cuban dissidents and Cuban immigration, where it's typically solicited it. And that's an interesting about face.
Yeah, and another interesting reversal of the Trump administration is the cutting of funding to the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which is an umbrella organization that funds, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and these types of propaganda media sources. And it also includes Radio Martí, which is quite interesting. Radio Martí was set up to send propaganda into Cuba. It's had a bit of a reputation that's been going downhill, I think, over the past few years. It's sort of seen as a relic of the Cold War. It's, very, very far right, and to the point that I think even some people who are against the Cuban government thought it was a little bit too far right. There was a lot of corruption scandals that have gone on with it, including, anti-Semitic comments against George Soros, people at the radio station embezzling money. So this has been shut down, and it's interesting to try to wrap your head around what the reasons for this are in Trump's mind, or Marco Rubio's mind, or whoever came up with this idea. I think a part of it has to do with the fact that I don't know if Trump is very much a fan of soft power and more so of like military and economic coercion, but I also think that with the spread of social media, things like Radio Martí just aren't as relevant as they may have been during the Cold War. There's also a TV Martí, which is basically completely blocked in Cuba. I think this might be just something where they think, why are we dumping money into these sort of old-fashioned forms of media to spread propaganda when there are new ways to do it?
Yeah, I think that there are more insidious means that are also basically unattributable, right? When you think about the media ecology of, I don't know, what is it already archaic to say Web 2.0, social media and so on. It's not the kind of top-down thing where you can find receipts and it's directly attributed to federal employees and so on, right? And you can move a lot more discreetly by way of mercenary, individually empowered commentators and people whose perspectives have, a kind of aura of authenticity, because we've all seen the comment section under things where people are like, oh, you don't know the truth. I am from Cuba. I have been to Cuba, and it's all anecdotal and it can't be fact checked and it's entirely unaccountable, and yet sort of poisons the discourse. And I think that that's a lot more effective than something like Radio Martí. The Cuban government, when it was defunded this week, called it a dinosaur. And I think that in some mediological respect, it's a dinosaur. It's also, as you said correctly, a relic of the Cold War. It's been defunded already somewhat, from $20 million per year to, I believe, $12 million per year, with 46 federal employees and maybe 100 workers, said the article that I read. And people being paid six figures. There's a certain amount of infamy in that, but do I think that the Trump administration, even under the sign of small government and cutting, do I think that they need to save that $12 million? I don't know if this shutdown will be absolute, but it's a very different strategy than even several years ago, when the Biden administration was being lobbied to increase the budget for TV Martí. Fidel Castro called it the biggest lie factory in modern memory.
Yeah, pretty accurate.
When you look at the practical infrastructural means by which these sorts of ideological intrusions occur as well, the TV station is even broadcasting from balloons and planes that are violating Cuban airspace. So on one hand, it's soft power, but advancing by quasi-military technological means, it's a completely disreputable project. And even if it's collateral damage of a more sweepingly stupid orientation toward the premise of government control over all manner of services, good and bad, by the Trump administration, I think that we should celebrate its demise alongside the Cuban government. I think that they're correct. It's a dinosaur. It's a dangerous and utterly deceiving relic. And I hope that we've seen the last of it.
Also the fact that it takes the name of Jose Martí, I think, is enough to celebrate its demise, because they have no right to claim the name of the revolutionary Jose Martí. So another sort of strange thing that Trump did recently was releasing some files having to do with the JFK assassination. And what's interesting is that in some of these documents, there's some interesting information that has been revealed about the United States covert operations against Cuba in the 60s, specifically after the Bay of Pigs invasion failed miserably, and they moved to other tactics. They called it the Cuba Project, but it's also known as Operation Mongoose. So these are some pretty, I think this is a lot of stuff that people who have been following Cuba-U.S. relations for any period of time probably won't be surprised by a lot of it, but it is just another case of the Cubans being proven right, that the things that Cuba's government has accused the U.S. government of, it always comes out to be the truth.
Yeah, and it's often worse than one might have thought, and again, startling in its clarity and precision of means, but also in how general those means are, drawing on all kinds of areas of social and economic life. It's really a vast design, and still surprising to me. Having been following this for so many years, you do eventually get to thinking, well, do you know the way that ideology works is not so readily attributable? And then you read something like this, and it's confirmation of a vast and a coordinated conspiracy.
You said something there at the beginning where it sort of rung a bell for me. Like, the language of these documents is so prosaic. Like, it's so straightforward, simple language. Like, maybe we can shoot Cuban boats out of the water. You know, it's just very simple, matter-of-factly, openly stating, this is how we're going to sabotage Cuba and their economy and their development. Right off the bat, there's some interesting things that that sort of sprung out to me. One of them was the mention of the stay behind net, which is a term that I'm mostly familiar with from NATO's Project Gladio, where after World War II, they had these stay behind forces that were fascists who were fighting inside NATO countries to combat the sort of prestige that communists had gained because of their role in fighting fascism in World War II. So they also had these stay behind people in Cuba, I suppose, from after the revolution, which is something that I hadn't really thought of in those terms. There's also talking about trying to get in with the Cuban Chinese community to see if there'd be anybody they could sort of influence towards becoming an agent. They talk about trying to get 100 Cubans who had left Cuba, trying to get them to return under the guise of being students so that they could become, again, agents for U.S. State Department efforts to destabilize the society and the government.
And really confirmation of things that Castro has spoken about for so long about agricultural sabotage and attempts to undermine Cuba's self-sufficiency by induced crop failures and biological warfare that would appear to be natural disasters. Chemical warfare, really, on the agricultural sector.
Yeah, and they, they specifically wanted to undertake acts of sabotage against rice, which is, when you consider the fact that under the Cuban Revolution, every household gets a food basket, and a large part of that food basket is rice. Like, they're literally talking about trying to starve the population of Cuba to the point that it rises up against its government. Like, this isn't, these are very serious actions that they're planning in these documents.
Absolutely, and very open trade war. There's no surprise to this, because I would say that this is the aspect that has been the most widely publicized and understood to date. We talk about this all the time, the effects of the U.S. blockade. But what's really alarming here, and I'll call back to an earlier episode on the likelihood of terrorist involvement in the La Cuba explosion. Here we have in writing a plan to disrupt trade with the USSR in nickel and so on by way of sinking Cuban ships, torpedoes, mines, plant sabotage. But it's clear as day in writing that they plan to torpedo Cuban ships that are transporting nickel to the USSR. And
they also talked about poisoning rice that Cuba was sending to the USSR. And, something interesting about the nickel is that in this document, it also shows that, they want to sabotage Cuba's trade to the USSR of nickel by, like you said, torpedoing the ships, even blowing up some of the mines. But then it also says that the sort of other aspect of this is also sabotaging Canadian trade with the USSR. They say that once they're successful with preventing Cuba from sending nickel to the USSR, they also have to make sure that Canada is unable to send nickel to the USSR. And they don't go into so much detail, and I would probably doubt that they would use such force against Canadian ships, although who knows. But it's interesting that it's in there, and the extraterritoriality of this U.S. desire to bring down Cuba is once again sort of thrown in your face, and you realize, how much the United States really doesn't care about anybody's sovereignty.
Well, absolutely, and there's a laundry list of countries in which they boast of contrived civil unrest: Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Guatemala, Mexico, Panama, Peru, Uruguay, Venezuela. As insidiously, they boast of exploitable access, right, to people in the progressive movements. They talk about utilizing labor and student movements. Less surprisingly, perhaps the Catholic Church, which has had a conflicted role in Cuba. It's a very all-encompassing plan.
Yeah, and this type of thing, you talking about how they try to target progressive forces like students and labor, and it reminds me of the stuff they do contemporarily with like musicians, where they connect with musicians, give them opportunities, give them money, and then to produce this sort of revolutionary music. So these psychological warfare operations that they carried out, they talk about really trying to bring down public opinion of Castro, something that was countered so effectively just by Cuba's internationalism and Castro's internationalism and the support that Cuba had for national liberation movements across the world, right? But it's interesting also, like, that one of the things they admit in this document is that based on their analysis, they were unable to find a top-level official of the Cuban government whose, quote, personal characteristics indicate that they would accept recruitment or agree to defection. So because they couldn't actually find someone attached to the revolution who was unhappy, who might want to turn into an agent for the U.S., they then talk about focusing on journalists, foreign officials, international business people, foreign lawyers, crime syndicates even, international detectives, and foreign police officials. So, it just goes to show you that, like, this was a very strong revolutionary movement that the people believed in, and so they had difficulty finding people who were actually involved in the government to turn against the Cuban government. And instead they had to, like, sort of go towards these either, I guess, like, petty bourgeois types or, international crime syndicates, which, is something obviously the CIA has been involved with for a long time.
Always powerful to remember how long the U.S. has been trying to do this to Cuba, and to such little avail. We're 6.5 decades into the U.S. employing every means at its disposal. Now, we started this episode talking about Trump taking a very different tack and proceeding upon the Cuban people and very many other fronts, not by means of soft power, but by means of open threat. There's also a kind of performance involved in all of these executive orders and what have you. Even the declassification of the Operation Mongoose files, it's a footnote to this enormous info dump that is supposed to satisfy, I suppose, one of the most tantalizing plots in the American imaginary. But this is, I think, also partly Trump using this really potent American mythology to appear to be this it's a contradictory figure, this anti-systemic executive, right? That he's going to hack apart the deep state and he's going to expose to the light all of the misdeeds of the American government, of which we are supposed to believe he is no part, but actually, do you know what I mean? Sort of an avenging figure, antagonistic of this old way of politicking. I don't think that that's believable at all, but then you get these funny revelations along the way. It's a very peculiar moment to be observing week by week.
And I think that it's also worth noting that, we also talked at the beginning of the podcast about the power grid and the power outages in Cuba. And right here, you see that, in 1961, the U.S. government, the CIA, they were talking about, sabotaging ships, transport facilities, but, communications facilities, equipment for refining petroleum, facilities for producing and distributing power. That's a direct quote from this document. Sabotaging industry, food supplies, key military and police installations, and material, I guess. So even the fact that they say back in 1961 that they're trying to sabotage the facilities for producing and distributing power. I mean, the Cuban government hasn't come out and blamed the United States specifically for sabotaging the power grid today, and it's more so about the blockade that doesn't allow them to get the parts to upgrade the power grid or the oil that they need to feed into the power grid. But you see that this is part of the U.S. plan, right? So when you see these articles in the Globe and Mail or wherever, the CBC, talking about how the Cuban government is to blame for these power outages, it's right here in black and white that this is the plan of the United States government.
Yeah, and I've never heard a claim, I recall Maduro talking at some point about the possibility of sabotage of Venezuela's electrical grid. I've never heard such a claim from Cuba, but it's apparent that sabotage can transpire by many means, as you say. And this is economic sabotage. This is economic warfare that has proved to be as efficacious where the U.S. aims are concerned.
And yet, as you say, they've been doing this for 60 years, and they've been unable to overthrow the revolution. And, as bad as things in Cuba might be or might get, there's no clear sign of the revolution succumbing to these pressures.
None whatsoever. It is contrived, as we see in these documents. That's a means that they like to employ too, and it has not taken root because the Cuban spirit perseveres.
El día primero aquel, lleno de emoción y ruido, alguien dijo conmovido y feliz, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel.